This is Death Behind the Painted Smile. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, your faithful companion on yet another expedition into the shadowed corners of human nature. Allow me to express our deepest gratitude to our devoted listeners across the globe. If this is your maiden voyage with us, do consider subscribing and leaving a comment telling us from which corner of the world you listen. In a house where everything ran flawlessly and nothing was ever truly right, the most dangerous person at the table was the one nobody thought to watch. Lower your lights. Pour yourself a calming tisane in the manner of Poirot himself, and ready those little grey cells of yours. Chapter 1. The House That Swallowed Its Own. Something is wrong in this house. Monsieur Poirot. Margaret Whitcombe had spoken the words with a peculiar flatness, as though she had rehearsed them many times and found, in the end, that no arrangement of syllables could adequately convey what she meant. She was a woman of perhaps 60, slim and composed, dressed in a grey wool skirt and a cream blouse that was perfectly pressed. Her hair was the colour of old pewter. Her hands, folded in her lap in the drawing-room of her London solicitor's office, were entirely still. Hercule Poirot regarded her with the careful, unobtrusive attention that his acquaintances sometimes mistook for idleness. He said nothing for a moment. In his experience, a person who had screwed their courage to the point of consulting a detective was best allowed to continue at their own pace. The hasty question and the too eager prompting, these things disturbed the natural order of confession. "Tell me," he said at last, smoothing the already smooth lapel of his coat, "what it is precisely that is wrong." She looked at the window. "I am not certain I can say precisely. That is rather the difficulty." "Then say imprecisely. We shall refine later." A faint expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile. "My husband has not been well. Gerald, he is 71, and he has the disposition of a man who has never been contradicted. His health is not the concern. What concerns me is—" She stopped. She began again. "There are things I notice. I have always noticed things. It is perhaps the only occupation I have been consistently permitted." Poirot tilted his egg-shaped head very slightly. That last sentence, delivered in the same even tone as the rest, was rather more interesting than it appeared. "And what have you noticed, Madame Whitcombe?" "That someone in my house wishes my husband harm." It was thus that Hercule Poirot came to Briar Hollow. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early October, when the Surrey countryside was doing its best to appear picturesque and largely succeeding. The lanes from the station were lined with beech trees in various stages of surrender, their leaves gone copper and rust and a deep, reluctant gold. The taxi driver, a talkative man from whom Poirot extracted information as easily as pulling thread from a spool, informed him that the Whitcombe family had owned Briar Hollow for 3 generations, that the old gentleman was a difficult sort, and that the house itself was always looked proper enough from outside, and that this qualifier said rather more than the man intended. The house, when it appeared at the end of a gravel drive, confirmed the evaluation. It was large without being grand, a Victorian pile of dark red brick that had accumulated extensions and additions over the decades like a person who cannot throw anything away. The garden was well kept, but not loved. It had the appearance of having been maintained out of obligation rather than pleasure. A gardener moved among the far rose beds with the hunched efficiency of a man who expected no thanks. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, admitted Poirot at the door. She was a woman of indeterminate age between 50 and 70, with the compressed, watchful manner of someone who had spent decades noticing everything and remarking upon nothing. She showed him to a guest room that smelled faintly of lavender, and the particular dampness of rooms not regularly occupied, and informed him that tea would be served in the drawing-room at 4. "The family is at home?" Poirot enquired pleasantly. "All of them," said Mrs. Hargreaves, with an inflection that conveyed, without for a moment departing from perfect propriety, that this was not entirely a cause for rejoicing. He descended at 4 to find them assembled with the air of people who have been arranged rather than gathered. The drawing-room was comfortable and slightly oppressive, crowded with the furniture of previous generations and with family photographs that covered the mantelpiece and the top of the piano, though Poirot noted, as he would note everything, that the photograph in the hall had been turned face down in its frame. Gerald Whitcombe occupied the wing chair by the fire as absolutely as a monarch occupies a throne. He was a large man, or had been. Age had diminished his body without diminishing his presence. His eyes were pale grey and entirely alert, moving from face to face with the habitual assessment of a man accustomed to rating everything around him. He acknowledged Poirot's introduction with the slight inclination of a head that expects the world to come to it. "Margaret tells me you have done some useful work," he said. "We shall see about that. I have told her this is all nonsense." Gerald. This from Thomas, the elder son, who stood near the window with a glass of whisky and the careful posture of a man perpetually braced for impact. He was perhaps 40, solid and fair, with the look of someone who has spent a great many years being reasonable. "Mr. Poirot is our guest." "He is a detective. I am aware of what he is." Daniel, the younger son, sat in the corner armchair, with his long legs stretched before him, and his expression arranged into studied indifference. He was thinner than Thomas, darker, with something restless about the set of his mouth. He did not speak. He watched his father with the particular attention of someone who has rehearsed several responses and cannot decide which to deploy. Clara, Thomas's wife, sat beside the fireplace with a piece of embroidery she was not doing. She was perhaps 35, with neat dark hair and observant brown eyes. She had the manner of a person who has learned to be very still in a room as a form of self-protection. When Poirot was introduced to her, she smiled with perfect warmth and said all the correct things, and Poirot had the impression that the warmth was genuine and the correctness effortful. Eleanor, Gerald's sister, was the last. She was older than her brother, very upright in her chair, with white hair and hands that gripped her teacup with a faint but unmistakable tension. She greeted Poirot with careful courtesy, and then withdrew into a private silence that had the quality of something held rather than merely absent. And there was Lucy. The granddaughter, Thomas and Clara's daughter, appeared briefly in the doorway, was shepherded in for introductions, and regarded Poirot with the frank, unguarded scrutiny of a child of 11 or 12, who has not yet learned that staring is impolite. She had her mother's dark eyes and, Poirot thought, considerably more of her mother's watchfulness than anyone in the room had perhaps noticed. "You have a magnificent house," Poirot remarked to the room at large, settling himself and accepting his tea. "It is home," said Margaret simply, from her position near the tea tray. She was pouring with the mechanical fluency of a woman who has performed this act 10,000 times. A cup for Gerald, which she sweetened with particular care. 2 careful spoons of sugar. Gerald did not look up from his paper. He did not check the tea. It was received as a thing that arrived like weather. Poirot observed this. He observed also that Daniel's eyes followed the teacup from Margaret's hand to his father's. That Clara watched Margaret with an expression Poirot could not immediately classify. Not suspicion precisely, but its quieter precursor. That Eleanor had not touched her own tea at all. The conversation during tea was of the customary sort: the garden, the autumn, a neighbour's dispute about a right-of-way. Gerald held forth on several subjects with authority. The others listened or appeared to listen. Margaret refilled cups. The fire crackled. A clock on the mantelpiece measured the hour in small, precise increments. It was, on the surface, the picture of domestic contentment. But Hercule Poirot had been in too many houses not to recognize what lay beneath the surface of this one. The smiles that were fractionally too prompt. The pauses that were fractionally too long. The way no one looked at anyone for quite long enough, or looked rather too long at the wrong moment. The weight of things unsaid which pressed upon a room as palpably as heat. He sipped his tea. He said very little. He watched Gerald Whitcombe accept his cup without a glance at the woman who had prepared it. Later, as Poirot mounted the staircase to his room, the third stair gave a long, mournful creak beneath his foot. He paused on the landing and looked back down into the hall. The face-down photograph lay on its little table in the lamplight, patient as a secret. Something is wrong in this house. Yes, Poirot thought. Something was very wrong indeed. The question was not whether it was wrong, but only how long it had been wrong and what, in this house of ordered surfaces and swallowed silences, it would take before the wrongness made itself heard. He did not yet know the answer, but he was quite sure, in the way he was sometimes quite sure of things before logic had fully caught up with instinct, that he would. Chapter 2. The routines of the house. The first morning at Briar Hollow, Poirot rose at 7 and observed. This was for him not a passive occupation. He stood at the window of his guest room in his dressing gown and watched the garden come into focus through the autumn mist with the deliberate attention of a man who knows that a house reveals itself most honestly before it believes anyone is looking. The gardener arrived at 7:30, moved methodically along the gravel paths, and did not look up at the house once. A cat crossed the lawn with the air of one who owns the property and regards its human occupants as a temporary inconvenience. At 7:45, a light appeared in the kitchen window. Margaret Whitcombe, Poirot had already ascertained, was invariably first. She had told him so herself, not as a complaint, but as a simple fact, in the manner of someone who has long since ceased to distinguish between the two. He dressed with his customary care, gave his moustaches their matutinal attention, and descended to find her alone in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the larder with the fluency of 40 years' practice. "You sleep well, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked without turning. "Tolerably well, I thank you. The third stair is, perhaps, not ideally suited to the nocturnal wanderer." She turned then, briefly. "I have been meaning to have it repaired. Gerald says it is not necessary." She returned to the stove. "He says a creaking stair is useful, That one always knows who is moving about the house at night." Poirot found this remark of considerable interest. He said only, "He is a practical man. I'm your husband." "He is a thorough one," said Margaret, and set a pot of porridge on the range. Breakfast at Briar Hollow was at 8:30, and it was, Poirot discovered, a ceremonial occasion. Not in any festive sense, but in the sense of a ritual whose precise choreography had been established long ago, and not since questioned. Gerald descended at 8:28, took his chair at the head of the table, and unfolded his newspaper with the deliberation of a man performing an act of territorial definition. Thomas came next, then Clara and Lucy together, then Daniel, who arrived at 8:34 with the studied lateness of a man asserting the only small independence available to him. Eleanor appeared last, moving quietly to her customary seat beside the window. Margaret served. She moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the invisible efficiency that Poirot had observed in her the previous evening. The efficiency of a woman whose competence had become so total as to be, in the eyes of those she served, a species of furniture. She set Gerald's porridge before him. She set beside it the small pot of honey that occupied its accustomed place at his end of the table. Poirot, who had positioned himself thoughtfully with a view of both the table and the sideboard, watched Gerald stir the honey into his porridge without particular interest and lift the first spoonful to his mouth. Then Poirot looked away and began a conversation with Eleanor about the garden. Eleanor was, he had concluded, a woman who had chosen silence not from vacancy, but from a surfeit of things she had decided not to say, as she spoke of the garden with real knowledge and a certain subdued pleasure. The late roses were good this year. The kitchen garden had been left too long. She recalled when it had been properly managed. There had been a time, she glanced briefly towards the window, when the whole south border was given over to sweet peas. Gerald had said they were not worth the trouble. "Ah," said Poirot. "And were they?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "They were the most beautiful things in the garden." Across the table, Daniel had been listening. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he applied himself to his toast with unnecessary vigour. After breakfast, Poirot undertook what he privately classified as a reconnaissance of the domestic geography. It was the work not of the legs, but of the eyes. But he moved unhurriedly through the ground floor rooms, pausing now and then to admire a picture or examine a bookshelf, which activities were in fact not admiration and not examination, but the thorough, patient cataloguing of a mind that discards nothing until it understands its weight. The drawing-room had been furnished over several decades without a governing principle, save that nothing had been removed. On the mantelpiece, family photographs stood in a line. Gerald and Margaret, young, on a lawn. Thomas at his wedding. Lucy as an infant. The face-down frame he had noted in the hall was absent from this display, which meant it was neither forgotten nor displayed, but deliberately obscured. This interested him. The locked pantry cupboard was in the passage beside the kitchen, a substantial lock, recently oiled. The key, Mrs. Hargreaves informed him when he inquired with pleasant vagueness about the household arrangements, was kept on a hook in the kitchen dresser. The cupboard contained, among other domestic stores, the rat poison used on the outbuildings. She volunteered this information without hesitation, and with the particular composure of a woman who has nothing to conceal and is faintly put out that anyone might suppose otherwise. "Rats are a problem in autumn," she said. "In many establishments they are a problem throughout the year." Poirot agreed pleasantly and moved on. He found Daniel in the library, staring at the garden through the French windows, with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man conducting a sustained argument with himself. The library had the feeling of a room that had once been used and was no longer, and the books were orderly and dustless and visibly untouched. A large mahogany desk dominated the far wall. Gerald's desk, without question. It had the same quality as the wing chair, of space thoroughly occupied and ownership thoroughly enforced. "You have returned to the family home recently, I understand," said Poirot, settling into a chair with the ease of a man who has been invited, though he had not. Daniel turned from the window. He had his mother's grey eyes, but none of her composure. 6 months ago. My father will have told you it was failure that brought me back." He paused. "It was. That is candid. There is very little point in being otherwise with you. I have read about you." He said this without flattery, merely as a statement of orientation. "The business in London did not work out. I came home because there was nowhere else, and because—" He stopped. "Because?" Poirot prompted very gently. Daniel looked at the desk. "Because my mother wrote to me. She wrote that she was tired." He said it as though the word contained more than its ordinary meaning, which Poirot suspected it did. "She has been tired for a very long time, and no one in this house has thought it worth mentioning." He returned his gaze to the garden. Poirot allowed the silence to stand for a moment, before excusing himself with the politeness of a man who has extracted precisely what he came for, and wishes to give no indication of it. He encountered Clara on the staircase, carrying a small stack of library books, with the slightly harassed air of a woman managing several things at once. She stopped, adjusted her grip on the books, and smiled. It was the same warm, careful smile as the previous evening, and Poirot found himself thinking that Clara was the sort of person who observed the world very accurately and had learned to keep her observations private. "I hope you are finding everything comfortable," she said. "Entirely, I thank you. It is a house with great character." Something moved in her eyes. "Yes, that is one word for it." She glanced upward in the direction of the upper corridor. "The nursery is up there. Lucy likes to sit in it sometimes. It is always terribly cold. There is something wrong with the heating on that side of the house. Gerald has never had it seen to." She caught herself, as though she had said more than she intended. "We manage perfectly well." "Of course," said Poirot, and stood aside to let her pass. He stood on the landing for a moment after she had gone, looking up towards the corridor she had indicated. Then he looked down. From here he could see the hall table and the face-down photograph. He descended. He crossed to the table. He lifted the frame, looked at it for a measured moment, and set it face down again precisely as he had found it. The photograph showed a young man he did not recognize, standing beside a considerably younger Margaret Whitcombe, in a garden that was not Briar Hollow. The young man had his arm around her shoulders and was laughing directly at the camera. Margaret was not laughing, but she was looking at him with an expression so unguarded, so entirely unlike anything Poirot had seen on her face since his arrival, that it rendered her, for a moment, almost unrecognizable. It was the expression of a woman who has not yet learned to be invisible. Poirot smoothed his moustache thoughtfully. Behind him, the clock on the hall wall ticked its way towards luncheon, and from the kitchen came the composed, unceasing sounds of a house being maintained. Chapter 3. The Morning of the Porridge. Gerald Whitcombe died on a Wednesday. The fact that it was a Wednesday struck Poirot later as one of those details that is simultaneously entirely irrelevant and somehow telling. Not a Monday, which might have suggested the bleak logic of a new week's resolution. Not a Friday with all its associations of conclusion. A Wednesday, the middle of things, the day belonging to no particular feeling, the day one endures rather than anticipates. A very ordinary day on which to commit an extraordinary act. But that understanding came afterwards. On the morning itself, Poirot was at breakfast before Gerald descended, and he was watching the sideboard. Mrs. Hargreaves had set the table at 8 o'clock with her usual efficiency. The porridge was brought through at 8:20, kept warm in its covered dish. The honey pot, a small earthenware jar with a cork stopper, was placed at Gerald's end of the table as it had been placed every morning. Poirot had by this point breakfasted at Briar Hollow for 3 days, and he had observed the honey pot on each occasion. He could not have said precisely why it preoccupied him. Something in the arrangement nagged at the orderly chambers of his mind in the way that a picture hanging 2 degrees off true nags at the eye of a man who values symmetry. Gerald had never, in those 3 mornings, used the honey. He took his porridge plain with salt, in the northern fashion he had adopted from some early influence, and never abandoned. The honey pot sat at his elbow like a small, patient hypothesis. He ignored it. Margaret placed it there each morning, and each morning it was removed untouched. Poirot had noted this. He had noted also that the jar appeared to be replenished at intervals. The level dropped and rose again, which suggested it was used by others at the table, probably Thomas or Clara, who were the sort of people who liked honey and would reach across without fuss. On this Wednesday morning, the honey was placed at Gerald's setting, as always, except that this morning the cork had already been removed. Poirot observed this from his chair. He said nothing. He watched Margaret take her seat, smooth her napkin, and reach for the teapot. He watched Thomas and Clara arrive with Lucy between them, sleepy and school-uniformed, her satchel abandoned in the hall. He watched Daniel slide into his seat at 8:36, 2 minutes later than his usual studied tardiness, looking as though he had not slept. Gerald came down at 8:28, as invariably he did, and took his chair. It was Lucy who provided the detail that Poirot would return to again and again in the hours that followed. She was spreading butter on her toast with the absorbed concentration of a child who has temporarily retreated from the adult conversation around her when she looked up and said, to no one in particular, "Grandfather said he'd try honey today." Thomas glanced at her. "Did he, sweetheart? When was that?" "Yesterday. He told me at tea. He said Mrs. Pennington at the village had sent a new sort, and he supposed he ought to try it." She returned to her toast. Around her, the table continued its ordinary morning. Gerald stirred his porridge, reached with the mildly put-upon air of a man honouring a commitment he had not quite intended to make, for the honey jar. Spooned a measure into the bowl, stirred again. 8. Poirot, whose porridge had been cooling untouched before him for some minutes, picked up his spoon. Gerald Whitcombe was dead before 10 o'clock. He complained of no pain at the table, or rather, he said nothing at the table that was not within the ordinary register of his complaints, which were numerous and various. It was only when Thomas found him collapsed in his study at 9:30, the morning paper still open across his knees, that the household understood something was catastrophically wrong. By the time the doctor arrived, there was nothing to be done. Dr. Lennox was a brisk Scotsman of 60 who had attended the Whitcombe family for 15 years and wore the expression of a man who does not permit himself to be surprised by human mortality. He was, however, surprised by this. He drew Thomas aside in the corridor with the gravity of a man choosing his words, and Poirot, who had positioned himself near the hall with a cup of coffee and an expression of retired inconsequence, heard the words, "not natural causes," and "the police, I'm afraid, Thomas," before the study door closed. The family absorbed the news in their several fashions. Thomas sat down heavily in the drawing room and put his head in his hands. He was a man to whom solid things mattered. Duty, a continuity, the proper running of affairs. And the solid world had lurched beneath him. Clara sat beside him, very straight, her hand on his arm. She said little. She was, Poirot thought, a woman who remained practical in emergencies as a form of love. Daniel, when told, stood very still for a moment. Then he walked to the window and remained there. His stillness had a different quality from his mother's. It was the stillness of a man who feels a great many things simultaneously and does not yet know which of them is permissible. Eleanor received the news with a pallor so complete and so sudden that Poirot moved instinctively to place a chair behind her. She sat without appearing to notice that she had done so. She said, in a voice stripped of its usual careful control, "How?" "That is what must be determined," said Poirot quietly, when she looked at him. The first time he realized that she had looked at him directly and without the varnish of social courtesy. There was something in her eyes beyond grief, something that looked very much like the knowledge of a secret whose time had, at last, come. Margaret was in the kitchen when Poirot went to find her. She was washing the breakfast things, the porridge pot, the cups, the honey jar, all arrayed in the draining rack with geometric precision. She turned at his step, her hands still wet, a dish towel held before her. "They will want to examine the kitchen," Poirot said very gently. "The breakfast things, the pantry. You understand that the police are coming." "Yes," she said. "I expected they would be." There was nothing in her voice that was not composed. No trembling, no excess. While she was looking at him with the particular attention she had given him since his arrival. The attention, he had come to understand, of a woman who has been waiting to be seen for a very long time. "The honey jar," said Poirot. "It was already open when the table was laid this morning. The cork was removed before breakfast." Margaret said nothing. "Gerald never used the honey," Poirot continued in the tone of a man thinking aloud. "Until this morning, when your granddaughter told us he had expressed an intention the previous day to try the new honey from Mrs. Pennington." Still, she said nothing. The draining rack stood between them. The honey jar gleamed, rinsed clean, the earthenware pale as chalk. "Who prepared the table this morning, Madame Whitcombe?" "I did," she said. "I always do." The answer was, of course, not an answer. It was the statement of a fact so long established as to be invisible, which was, Poirot was beginning to understand, precisely where the truth in this house had always lived. Inspector Graves of the Surrey Constabulary arrived at noon. He was a competent, agreeable man who would do the necessary work thoroughly and reach the necessary conclusions at the necessary pace. Poirot, who had been introduced as a house guest and retired detective, the first accurate, the second, on this occasion, a deliberate understatement, offered his cooperation, which was accepted with polite scepticism, and his intention to remain at Briar Hollow for the present, which was accepted with rather less. The arsenic was found in the afternoon. Not residue, but source. The tin in the locked pantry cupboard, its contents disturbed, measurably, weighably, if one knew what to look for. Inspector Graves knew what to look for. He was satisfied with the pantry and with the preliminary report from Dr. Lennox, and he looked at Daniel Whitcombe with the quiet, attentive look of a man assembling a case. Daniel noticed. Everyone noticed Daniel noticing. His jaw set, and he said, in the flat voice of a man controlling himself with some effort, "I would like to telephone my solicitor." That evening, Poirot sat alone in the drawing-room after the family had retired. The fire had burned to embers. The wing chair stood empty at its angle to the hearth. Not moved, not covered, simply unoccupied, which was its own kind of statement. The clock ticked. Outside, the Surrey darkness pressed quietly against the windows. On the mantelpiece, the family photographs stood in their line. Gerald and Margaret on a lawn, young and unreturning. The others arranged around them like planets around a sun that had, that morning, gone out. Poirot looked at the empty chair for a long time. Then he looked at the kitchen doorway, through which even now came the faint sound of something being set in order. The house, he thought, already knew how to proceed without Gerald Whitcombe. It had been practicing for years. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. The trouble with the obvious suspect, Poirot had once remarked to a long-suffering acquaintance, is not that he is obvious. It is that he is so very convenient. He was thinking of this the following morning as he watched Inspector Graves conduct his interviews in the dining room. The inspector had commandeered the table with a business-like efficiency that Poirot found professionally admirable and personally instructive. A man who appropriates the dead man's table without ceremony either has no imagination or has learned to suppress it. In Graves's case, Poirot suspected the former and did not hold it against him. Imagination was not, in any case, the inspector's assignment. His assignment was Daniel Whitcombe. The case against Daniel had the satisfying simplicity of a thing assembled without effort. He had motive, the long, unhealed grievance of a son who had returned from failure to find his father's approval as remote as it had always been. He had access. He lived in the house and knew where the key to the locked pantry hung. He had opportunity. He was, on the morning in question, of the last to come to breakfast, unaccounted for in the preceding half hour. Inspector Graves was not a man to overlook such a confluence. Daniel sat at the far end of the commandeered table and answered questions with the coiled, rigid calm of someone who has decided that composure is his only available defense. He denied, clearly and without elaboration, any knowledge of how arsenic had come to be in his father's porridge. He denied having entered the pantry in the preceding week. He denied, with a flash of feeling that was the closest he had come to anything unguarded, that he had wanted his father dead. "I wanted him to acknowledge," Daniel said to the middle distance. "That is rather different." Graves wrote something in his notebook. Poirot, seated in the corner with an expression of benign superannuation, I made no note, but forgot nothing. After Graves had finished with Daniel and moved on to Thomas, Poirot rose with the unhurried deliberation of a man whose joints require consideration. excused himself to no one in particular, and went in search of Eleanor. He found her in the conservatory, a lean-to structure along the east side of the house, presently given over to the dying ambitions of several pot plants, and Gerald's collection of orchids which were in much better condition. Eleanor stood among them with her arms folded and her gaze directed at the garden, and turned when Poirot entered with the look of a woman who has been expecting an interruption, without knowing precisely from which direction it would arrive. "The orchids are remarkable," said Poirot. "Gerald grew them. He had great patience with things that could not answer back." She said this without particular bitterness. It was, in her voice, simply the statement of a long-observed fact. "What is it you wish to ask me, Monsieur Poirot? I am aware that your sitting in corners and saying nothing is not, in fact, saying nothing." Poirot smiled. He had a great respect for intelligence that did not announce itself. "The photograph in the hall," he said. "The young man beside your sister-in-law. Who was he?" Something shifted in Eleanor's posture. Not quite a flinch, more the involuntary adjustment of a person who has been carrying a weight and momentarily felt its full measure. She was quiet for long enough that the conservatory filled with the small sounds of plants and glass and distant domestic activity. "His name was Robert Ashfield," she said at last. "He and Margaret were engaged before Gerald." "I see. And what became of Mr. Ashfield?" "He went to Canada. Gerald saw to it." Eleanor's eyes moved to the orchids. Robert had no money and no particular prospects. Gerald had both, and he had also a talent for making alternatives disappear. Margaret was 23. Her family approved of Gerald. Robert received, I have always believed, a sum of money and a strong encouragement to pursue his prospects at some distance. She paused. Margaret was not consulted. She was told? She was told that Robert had withdrawn his interest and that Gerald Whitcombe had made a most suitable offer. Eleanor's voice was even, which cost her something. Poirot could hear the cost. "I was 19. I knew the truth because I happened to overhear a conversation between Gerald and our father. I was not supposed to know. I have known for 50 years. And Margaret?" Eleanor met his eyes. "I have never been certain. She has never spoken of it. But Margaret is not, she has never been, a stupid woman. I think she understood more than she was intended to, and understood also that understanding would change nothing." She uncrossed her arms and crossed them again in a slightly different arrangement. "The photograph was on the hall table when I arrived here for Christmas 3 years ago. It has been face down ever since. I don't know who turned it over." "But not Margaret herself, you think?" "No," said Eleanor. "Not Margaret." Poirot thanked her and withdrew. He stood for a moment in the corridor and examining the wallpaper with apparent interest, and then walked slowly towards the kitchen. Mrs. Hargreaves was making pastry. She acknowledged his entrance with a nod that combined welcome with the faint reservation of a woman who considers the kitchen her sovereign territory and extends visitation rights under sufferance. "I wonder," said Poirot, seating himself uninvited on the chair beside the dresser, "if you might satisfy a small curiosity. How long have you been with the family, Mrs. Hargreaves?" 22 years in March," she said without looking up from the pastry board. "Then you will have seen the family at close quarters, more closely than most." He allowed a small pause. "Mr. Daniel, he arrived back in April, I understand. Was there difficulty on his return?" The pastry received additional attention. There is always difficulty," Mrs. Hargreaves said carefully, "when a grown man returns to his father's house." "Quite so. And the relationship between Mr. Gerald and Mrs. Whitcombe, in your observation, was it a contented one?" She looked up at that. The look was not hostile, but it was measured. "I prepare food and manage the household, Monsieur Poirot. I don't observe relationships. Forgive me, I phrased the question wrongly." He settled his hands on his knees with an air of gentle correction. "Let me ask instead, was Mrs. Whitcombe happy in this house?" Mrs. Hargreaves turned back to the pastry board. She worked in silence for perhaps 10 seconds. 10 seconds being, in Poirot's experience, a very long time to take before answering a question about another person's happiness. "She was devoted to this house," Mrs. Hargreaves said. She gave it everything." It was, Poirot reflected, an answer of remarkable precision. Devoted to the house, not to the man, not to the life, to the house itself, to the function, the performance of care, the output of a devotion whose object had perhaps, somewhere along its long course, quietly changed. He left Mrs. Hargreaves to her pastry and went upstairs to think. He sat in the chair by the window of his guest room and arranged what he knew in the orderly fashion that was as natural to him as breathing. The obvious facts presented themselves first, as obvious facts always did, with the confidence of the unexamined. Daniel, the motive, the arsenic, the opportunity. He placed these to one side, not discarding them, merely declining to be seduced by their tidiness. Then the other things. The honey jar are already open before the family descended. Margaret, first in the kitchen each morning without exception, who prepared the table as she prepared everything, with total, invisible authority. Lucy's remark about Gerald's stated intention to try the honey, which meant that someone had known the previous day that Gerald would, on this particular morning, depart from his habits, which meant that someone had prepared for that departure, someone who knew his habits absolutely, because she had maintained them for 40 years. Someone who had that morning been in the kitchen before anyone else was awake. Poirot looked at the wall. Below him, through the floorboards, came the sound of the household proceeding. Footsteps in the hall, a door, the kettle. The immovable, patient rhythm of a house in which one person had, for 4 decades, I ensured that the rhythm never faltered. Daniel Whitcombe had motive and access, and a furious, unconcealed resentment that announced itself at every meal. It was, Poirot thought, almost too much. A man who truly intended to commit murder did not generally sit at his father's table, wearing his intentions as plainly as a name tag. He reached for his small notebook. He wrote 2 words, underlined them once, and closed the cover. Outside, the October afternoon was fading. Somewhere below, a door opened and the voice of Inspector Graves carried briefly up the stairwell. Patient, thorough, entirely focused on the wrong Whitcombe. Chapter 5. What the Walls Have Heard. On the 3rd day after Gerald's death, Poirot went to look at the pantry cupboard with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who suspects a room has something left to say. Inspector Graves had been through it thoroughly, as he had been through the entire house. The tin of rat poison had been photographed, weighed, and noted. The key on the kitchen dresser hook had been examined for fingerprints. A smudged and inconclusive exercise, as the hook was used daily by Mrs. Hargreaves, Margaret, and in principle by anyone else with access to the kitchen, which meant the whole of the household. Graves had documented all of this with the methodical patience of a craftsman who trusts his materials. He had also by now quietly confirmed that Daniel had no verifiable account of his movements on the morning of the murder, between 7:30, when Mrs. Hargreaves had heard him on the landing, and 8:34 when he had appeared at breakfast. Poirot found this interesting, but not in the way Graves found it interesting. He stood in the pantry doorway and looked at the floor. The boards were old stone flags, as in much of the ground floor, and they collected a fine, pale dust between the grouting that was, in its way, as reliable a record-keeper as any notebook. The area directly before the poison cupboard showed disturbance consistent with regular access. A broad, somewhat worn patch where feet had stood over many years. The edges of this worn patch were crisp and unremarkable, which meant that no one had stood there recently in any unusual fashion. No second pair of feet, no lateral movement suggesting a longer or more complicated visit than the ordinary retrieval of household stores. Poirot crouched, with the measured, dignified caution of a man who treats his own joints with the respect due to precision instruments, and examined the lowest shelf of the open cupboard beside the poison tin. Flour, salt, a tin of bicarbonate, all of them lightly filmed with the same pale dust. Except the salt tin, whose base described a clean arc in the dust where it had recently been replaced, not quite in its original position. Poirot stood, brushed his knees, and went to find Mrs. Hargreaves. He discovered her in the linen cupboard on the first floor, engaged in counting sheets with the preoccupied ferocity of a general conducting an audit before battle. She answered his question about the salt tin with the slight frown of a woman for whom domestic disarray is a personal affront. "I moved it myself 2 days before it happened. We were running low. I was checking the level." She paused. "I replaced it. I'm quite certain I replaced it correctly." "But of course," said Poirot pleasantly. "Tell me, when you entered the pantry those 2 days prior, was the key on the hook as usual?" "It is always on the hook, unless Mrs. Whitcombe has it." "Mrs. Whitcombe takes the key herself from time to time?" "When she uses the preserves or the stores for her baking." Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, an unusual occurrence. She was not a hesitating woman. "She had it on the Tuesday, the day before. She was making something, I think. I didn't ask. I had the key back by afternoon." Poirot thanked her warmly and left her to her sheets. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stood there for a time, watching the garden below. The gardener was raking leaves along the south border with the rhythmic patience of a man long accustomed to the fact that what he clears today will need clearing again tomorrow. There was something instructive in that, Poirot thought, though he did not pursue the metaphor. He was thinking about Margaret's kitchen routines. He had observed them for 3 mornings before the murder, and he had been observing them since. They were precise to a degree that had initially struck him as the natural fluency of habit, but which he was now reconsidering. Margaret moved through the kitchen as a musician moves through a piece long practiced, each action in its prescribed sequence, each element appearing at its appointed moment. The porridge at 8:20, the tea at 8:25, Gerald's cup sweetened with 2 careful spoons, the table laid in a fixed arrangement, Gerald's end always last. On the morning of the murder, one element had been present that was not in the ordinary sequence: the honey jar already uncorked. This was not in itself a damning observation. A jar may be uncorked for any number of innocent reasons, and Poirot had been careful not to mistake his observations for conclusions. But it sat beside the other thing he had been turning in his mind. Gerald had told Lucy of his intention to try the honey. He had done so at tea the previous afternoon, which meant that between Tuesday tea and Wednesday morning, someone in that house had known Gerald would reach for the honey jar, and someone had ensured it would be ready for him. Poirot descended to the garden by the side door and walked slowly along the path that ran beside the kitchen windows. He was not precisely looking for anything. He was allowing his mind the freedom of movement that the indoors sometimes denied it. The air was cold and smelled of leaf mould and the particular mineral sharpness of October earth. The kitchen herbs grew in a raised bed along the wall: rosemary, thyme, a struggling sage, flat-leaf parsley that had largely given up. They had been recently watered, or so the dark earth at their roots suggested, though the morning had been dry. He paused. He looked at the herbs. He looked at the kitchen window where the pale light of mid-morning fell through the glass. Then he went to find Daniel. Daniel was in the library again, which had established itself as his territory in a house where territories had been sharply contested. He had a book open on the desk, Gerald's desk, a small act of post-mortem possession that Poirot filed without emphasis, but was not reading it. He looked up with the wary directness that had become his habitual mode in Poirot's presence. "I want to ask you about the business in London," said Poirot, settling himself. "Not the failure itself. I'm not concerned with that. I want to know what you were doing in the period before you returned." Daniel looked at him for a moment with frank assessment. "Import and export. The legitimate kind, before you wonder. Textiles, primarily. A partner I trusted rather more than he warranted." He turned a page of the unread book without looking at it. "I lost a considerable amount of money, and more to the point, I lost the ability to convince myself that hard work and good intentions are sufficient. They are not. My father told me so repeatedly, and I thought it was his particular cruelty. It turns out it was merely accurate. He was not a man who offered comfort. He was not a man who believed comfort served any useful function." Daniel paused. "He was not always wrong. He was simply relentless. There was no interval between his being right about something and his needing you to know he was right about it." Poirot nodded slowly. "Your mother bore this over many years." Something in Daniel's expression shifted, not breaking, but thinning, the way ice thins before it gives. "My mother," he said carefully, "is the strongest person in this family. She has managed everything. This house, this family, my father. For 40 years without a word of complaint that I have ever heard." He stopped. He looked at the window. "When I came back in April, I saw her in the garden. She had been weeding along the back border. She stood up and she just stood there for a moment, very still, with her hand pressed to her side, and I realized she had fallen, and no one had seen." His voice did not change its register. "I was there within 20 seconds. She said she was perfectly all right. She had been lying on the ground for, I don't know how long. She refused to say." "And your father?" "Was in his study." The two words landed with the weight of a verdict. "He was told at dinner. He said she ought to be more careful." The library was quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece, which Poirot had not noticed before, was a twin to the one in the drawing room. Probably a pair, probably a wedding gift. Probably separated at some point for reasons no one now remembered. "Ah, you did not kill your father," said Poirot. He did not frame it as a question. Daniel met his eyes steadily. No. No. Poirot rose. This I have believed for some time. The difficulty, he added, with the gentle precision of a man choosing his words for their exact weight, is that the alternative requires me to entertain a truth that is, in its way, considerably more distressing. He left Daniel with that, and walked back through the hall past the face-down photograph, past the creaking third stair towards the kitchen, where the smell of something baking moved through the house, like a memory of ordinary days. Margaret was at the table working pastry with her usual even strokes. She looked up at him with the calm of a woman who has made her peace with something, and is waiting, at her own pace, to be asked about it. It is a small thing, she said, before Poirot had spoken at all, to be unseen. One does not notice it happening at first. It is only later, much later, that one looks back and finds one cannot identify the precise moment at which it became complete. Poirot sat down across from her. The pastry moved under her hands. He said nothing because nothing was required. He corrected everything, she said quietly. The way I spoke, the order of things at the table, my opinions when I offered them, which eventually I stopped doing. The garden, I planted sweet peas one year along the south border, and he had them taken out. Her hands continued their work. It is not that any single thing was very terrible. It is that all the things together, over all the years together, I make a sum that is rather hard to calculate. She pressed the pastry flat with the heel of her hand. The kitchen smelled of flour and cold butter, and the thyme from the garden outside the window. The murder, Poirot said at last, very gently, did not begin at breakfast. Margaret looked at him with those steady grey eyes, and did not deny it. Chapter 6. The Weight of Small Things. There are conversations that do not end when they end. Poirot carried Margaret's words with him through the remainder of that day and into the next morning, turning them over with the patient industry of a lapidary who suspects a stone of containing more than its surface reveals. She had said nothing in those final quiet minutes in the kitchen that constituted confession. She had described her marriage in terms of erosion rather than event, and she had allowed his last observation to stand unanswered, which was a very different thing from confirming it. A good defence barrister, and Gerald Whitcombe's family would retain the best available, would make something of that distinction. But Poirot was not yet constructing a case for the courts. He was constructing the truth, which was his prior obligation, and sometimes an inconvenient one. On the fourth morning after the death, he rose early and went to the kitchen before Margaret was there. This required some adjustment to his habits, as Margaret had not once been anticipated in the kitchen since his arrival. He descended at 6:30, moving with particular care on the third stair, and found the kitchen empty and the pre-dawn grey at the windows. He turned on the single overhead light, which gave the room the flat, the honest illumination of a stage between performances, and looked at it properly for the first time, unmediated by its usual activity. Everything was in its place with the precision of a display. The copper pots ranked by size, the utensils in their earthenware jar, the herbs drying in a bunch above the window. The kitchen dresser held its usual appointments: the key hook, the cookery books with their creased spines, a small calendar on which Margaret had written the week's domestic engagements in a hand so regular it might have been typeset. He scanned the current week. Monday, butcher. Tuesday, preserves. Thursday, herbs. Thursday, herbs. He looked at the calendar for a measured moment. Then he looked at the window, beyond which the raised herb bed was a dim rectangle in the early light. Mrs. Hargreaves had mentioned, on the day of his arrival, that Margaret watered the kitchen herbs on Thursdays. He had filed this as he filed everything, without yet knowing its weight. He filed now, beside it, the fact that the herb bed had shown signs of recent watering on a Wednesday morning. The morning of the murder, when the day had been dry, and Thursday had not yet come. The rhythm had faltered. He heard her on the stair, the third step silent beneath her feet, because she knew to avoid it, because this was her house, and she knew every particular of it. And he was seated at the kitchen table with an expression of early morning benignity when she came through the door. She stopped, just briefly, and then she did not stop. She moved to the stove with the smooth continuity of a woman who has learned to absorb surprises without showing their impact. "You are early, Monsieur Poirot." "I found I could not sleep. The country air, you know. It is invigorating, but it does not always encourage repose." He watched her fill the kettle. "I have been looking at your calendar. You are very methodical." "A house like this requires method." "Quite so." He paused. "You water the herbs on Thursdays." The kettle went onto the range. Her back was to him. "Generally. But on Wednesday last, the morning of Mr. Whitcombe's death, they had been freshly watered. I noticed the soil." He kept his voice gentle, observational, free of any quality that might be construed as pressure. "It is a small thing." "Small things require attention," said Margaret, "or they become large ones." She turned and met his eyes, and Poirot understood, but as he had been understanding by degrees since that first conversation in the drawing-room on his arrival, that Margaret Whitcombe was a woman who had made her decision in full knowledge of what it was. There was no confusion in her. There was something that he might, in other circumstances, have called serenity, though serenity seemed too light a word for whatever it was that had settled in her. "You were in the pantry on Tuesday," said Poirot. "Mrs. Hargreaves confirms it, and you were in the garden on Wednesday morning, before the household was awake." He folded his hands on the table. "You had heard Lucy tell you, at tea, what your husband had said about the honey." "Lucy told everyone at tea," said Margaret. "I was in the kitchen." It was a careful reply, not a denial, not an admission, but the precise indication of a woman who understands the value of silence and is choosing, today, to break it only in measured increments. Poirot found himself admiring it, which troubled him, because admiration was not among the appropriate responses available to him. "Tell me," he said, "about the fall in the garden." Something changed in her face. Not broke. Margaret Whitcombe, he had concluded, was not a woman who broke, but shifted like a landscape when the cloud cover moves and the light falls differently on the same ground. "Daniel told you." "He described what he saw. He didn't describe what you felt." She was quiet for a long moment. The kettle began its preliminary murmuring on the range, the sound of water approaching a decision. "I had been weeding the back border," she said at last. She moved to the table and sat down, which she had not done in his presence in the kitchen before, had never, he realized, sat while he sat, as though the kitchen were not a room in which she was permitted to be still. "I stood up too quickly. I went down rather badly on my hands and my side. I lay there for, I don't know how long. Not very long, perhaps. Long enough? Long enough for what? Long enough to look at the sky. Her hands lay flat on the table. It was quite blue. There were no clouds to speak of. I lay there looking at it, and I thought, no one knows I am here. Not because they are busy or because they have not noticed yet. Simply because, in the ordinary running of the day, my whereabouts are not something that anyone monitors. I exist to monitor the whereabouts of everything else. She paused. It is a strange thought to have, lying on the ground, that if you did not get up, the most immediate consequence would be that dinner was late. Poirot said nothing. It was not the moment for speech. Gerald was told at dinner, she continued. He said I ought to be careful. Thomas said he was sorry to hear it. Daniel looked at his plate. She considered. Daniel was angry. He is a person whose feelings live on the outside, which is a quality I have always found both difficult and rather touching. The faintest alteration crossed her mouth. Not quite a smile. Clara asked whether I ought to see the doctor. I said no. That was the end of the matter. And afterwards? Afterwards I understood something. She said it simply, without drama, in the tone of a woman reporting a fact. I had understood it before, I think, in fragments over the years. The fall assembled the fragments, and I'd given 40 years to this family, to this house, to Gerald, to the children, to the maintenance of a life that ran smoothly, precisely because I made it do so. And the understanding was this, that if the function ceased, I would be missed, but that the function and I were not, in anyone's accounting, the same thing. The kettle reached its conclusion. She rose, moved to the range, and made the tea with the same unhurried competence with which she made everything. 2 cups, Poirot noted. She brought them to the table. You asked me once, she said, sitting again, whether I was happy in this house. I asked Mrs. Hargreaves that question, said Poirot. Not you. I know, I was in the corridor. She set his cup before him. I have been the sort of person people ask about rather than asking. I have grown accustomed to it. She looked at her own cup. To answer the question, I loved this house. I loved my children. I loved in the beginning Gerald Whitcombe. A pause. The beginning was a long time ago. They drank their tea. Outside, the garden came gradually into its morning colours, the pale gold of the beech trees and the deep, wet green of the lawn, and somewhere along the south border, where the sweet peas had once been and were, no longer, the gardener's boots crunched on the gravel and began the slow day's work. What happens now? Said Margaret. She asked it as a practical question with no detectable self-pity, which Poirot found, in its way, the hardest thing to hear. Now, said Poirot carefully, I must think. He turned his cup on its saucer a precise quarter rotation. There are things that must be faced. There are things that must be said to Inspector Graves. These are not actions I undertake without the full weight of their consequence. He looked at her steadily. But I will not deceive you as to what faces you. I have never in my life allowed an innocent man to suffer for the guilt of another. This principle has not changed. Margaret nodded once. She understood him perfectly, and he understood that she understood, and the kitchen held that mutual comprehension in the thin October light for a moment that was, Poirot thought, more honest than anything else that had passed between any 2 people in Briar Hollow for a very long time. Then she rose and began with absolute composure to make the porridge. Chapter 7. The Hand That Feeds. Inspector Graves arrived at Briar Hollow that same morning with the expression of a man who has received a satisfactory telephone call from his superiors and expects the next few hours to proceed accordingly. He informed Poirot in the hall, obtained a warrant. The laboratory analysis of the honey jar, retrieved, rinsed from the draining rack, which had been Mrs. Hargreaves's doing and not anyone's calculation, had nonetheless yielded sufficient trace residue to confirm the presence of arsenic. The quantity indicated in the residue, taken together with the reduction in the pantry tin and the preliminary findings of the post-mortem, was consistent with a lethal dose administered in a single application. The inspector was, in short, satisfied with both his evidence and the direction in which it pointed. "You will speak to Daniel Whitcombe this morning?" said Poirot. "I will, yes." Graves regarded him with the amiable patience of a man who has learned to tolerate the proximity of famous detectives without being deflected by them. "Unless you have something to add, Monsieur Poirot, that would materially alter the picture." Poirot considered this with the appearance of a man consulting an internal catalogue. "I have observations," he said. "They are not yet in the condition of a formal statement. But I ask you, Inspector, with great respect for your thoroughness, which is genuine, to grant me the remainder of the morning before you proceed." Graves studied him. "You have something." "I have several things. Whether they constitute the same thing is what I am presently establishing." He tilted his head with the mild courtesy of a man making a modest request. 2 hours, Inspector, after which I place everything I have before you without reservation." Graves looked at his watch, looked at Poirot, and agreed with the air of a man making a concession he will not regret. Poirot spent the first of his 2 hours in the garden. He walked the full perimeter of the kitchen herb bed, which was a small rectangle of perhaps 4 feet by 8, bordered by weathered brick and set against the south-facing wall of the house. The rosemary had grown to a considerable size and was beginning to encroach upon the thyme. The parsley had self-seeded untidily along the left edge. The soil throughout was dark and close-grained, the kind that retains moisture well, and in the far right corner, beside the struggling sage, the earth was visibly darker still. Freshly turned, very recently watered, and pressed flat again with what appeared to be the careful flattening of a hand rather than the broad pressure of a watering can. He crouched and looked at this section for some time. Then he stood and looked at the kitchen window, through which the room was visible, the range, the dresser, the table, the calendar on the wall, and, at this angle, the pantry passage door, which stood open as it generally did during the day. He went inside. He went to the pantry and stood once more before the cupboard. He was not looking at the cupboard now, but at the shelf beside it, and specifically at the row of preserving jars that occupied the lower shelf. Blackcurrant, greengage, a dark amber that was probably quince, each jar sealed with a waxed disc and labelled in Margaret's typeset hand. Beside the preserves stood a row of smaller jars, dried herbs, seeds, the modest pharmacy of a kitchen garden. He read the labels: rosemary, bay, thyme, chamomile. And at the end of the row, a small jar without a label. It contained a pale granular substance that might, at a casual glance, be mistaken for coarse salt or ground dried herb. Poirot did not touch it. He looked at it for precisely as long as necessary, noting its position. End of the row, closest to the door. and the fact that it was the only jar in the cupboard without a label, in a cupboard where everything else was labelled with Margaret's customary precision. He left the pantry and went to find Thomas. Thomas was in the study, his father's study, inhabited now with the reluctant duty of a man who has stepped into a role he did not seek and cannot decline. He was working through papers at the mahogany desk with the focused misery of a person performing grief and administration simultaneously, which is among the less merciful demands made on the bereaved. He looked up when Poirot entered with the expression of a man grateful for interruption and ashamed of the gratitude. "I want to ask you about your mother," said Poirot, settling himself. "Not about the investigation. About her, as a person, as you know her." Thomas set down his pen. He thought about this with the honest effort of a man who is accustomed to thinking about his father, and has perhaps not turned the same attention in the other direction with equal regularity. "She's the most capable person I have ever known," he said at last. "I mean that precisely. Not as a compliment, but as an observation. She can do anything that needs doing, and she does it without requiring acknowledgement. The house runs because she runs it. We relied upon that. Completely." He paused, and something uncomfortable moved across his face. Perhaps too completely. "It did not occur to you," Poirot said carefully, "that she might one day reach the limit of what she could carry?" Thomas was quiet for a moment that was different in quality from ordinary quiet, denser, more accountable. "No," he said. "It didn't occur to me. She never indicated." He stopped. He tried again. That is not an excuse. I am aware that it is not an excuse. I am not distributing blame, Thomas, and I am establishing understanding." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Your mother fell in the garden in April. She lay on the ground for some time before Daniel found her." "I know. I was sorry. You expressed this." "At dinner, yes." "And then?" Another silence. Thomas looked at the papers before him without seeing them. "And then dinner was finished, and the evening went on, and the next morning things were as they always were, and I—" He stopped, and I let them be. Poirot nodded. He asked nothing further on the subject, because nothing further was necessary. He had not come to prosecute Thomas's conscience, which was already conducting its own proceedings without assistance. "One more thing," said Poirot, rising. "The unlabelled jar on the lower shelf of the pantry cupboard. Do you know what it contains?" Thomas frowned. "The pantry? I don't go in there as a rule. Mother manages all of that." He shook his head. "I couldn't tell you." "No matter," said Poirot pleasantly. "It is, in all likelihood, nothing significant." It was, in all likelihood, the final piece. He spent the remainder of his 2 hours in his room, seated at the small writing desk with his notebook open before him, working through the sequence with the methodical satisfaction of a man assembling a mechanism whose components he has collected one by one and now, at last, finds complete. The picture had been present in outline since the morning of the murder. Each subsequent day had added resolution. The pantry key, the herb calendar, the broken Thursday routine, the unlabelled jar, and beneath all of it, providing the architecture upon which every visible detail rested, the 40 years of a marriage in which one person had been progressively reduced to a function and had finally, with extraordinary composure and terrible clarity, decided that the function would be better performed in the other direction. He did not find himself angry with Margaret Whitcombe. This was itself a thing to be examined, and he examined it with the same unflinching attention he gave to everything. He was not angry because he understood her, and understanding is the solvent of simple moral reactions. He understood what she had endured. He understood the fall in the garden and the blue sky and the arithmetic of erasure. He understood the moment. He could almost locate it, almost feel its particular temperature, at which the accumulated weight of small things had become something she could no longer lift. None of this altered what had been done. None of it altered what he was required to do. He closed his notebook, straightened the items on the writing desk, the pen parallel to the edge, the ink bottle equidistant between pen and notebook corner, and went downstairs to speak to Inspector Graves. He found him in the hall. He found also that the family had assembled in the drawing room in the way that families sometimes assemble when they are waiting for something they know is coming and have agreed, without discussion, to face together. Thomas stood by the mantelpiece. Clara sat with her hands in her lap. Daniel was at the window, his back to the room. Eleanor occupied her customary chair, very upright, her eyes on the door. Lucy was not present, as Clara had sent her upstairs with the instinctive protectiveness of a mother who understands that some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. And Margaret sat in her own chair, not Gerald's, never Gerald's, but the smaller chair to its left that had always been hers, and which she occupied now with the quiet, undemonstrative composure of a woman who has set down a very heavy thing and is simply, for the moment, resting. Poirot looked at her across the room. She looked back at him with those steady grey eyes, and for just a moment, a fraction of a moment, the space between one breath and the next, he saw again the woman in the face-down photograph. Unguarded, entirely present, the person she had been before Briar Hollow and Gerald Whitcombe, and 40 years of invisibility had layered themselves over her like sediment over something living. He turned to Inspector Graves. "I am ready," said Hercule Poirot, "to tell you what happened." Chapter 8. The System Examined. The drawing-room at Briar Hollow had, in Poirot's experience of it, always held the quality of a room in which the important things were not said. It seemed appropriate, therefore, that it should now hold a company of people waiting for exactly the opposite. Inspector Graves had positioned himself near the door with the practical instinct of a man who considers exits a professional consideration. He had his notebook, his pen, and the reserved, attentive expression of someone who has agreed to observe a performance without being entirely certain what kind of performance to expect. Poirot had spoken to him briefly in the hall, and had told him enough to ensure his cooperation, and not quite enough to remove the element of surprise, which was, Poirot had long found, the most useful condition in which to conduct a final explanation. He stood before the fireplace. Gerald's wing chair was at his left elbow, empty, and he was conscious of its emptiness in the way one is conscious of a word that has been removed from a sentence. The meaning shifts around the gap. "I will begin," said Poirot, "not with what happened, but with how it was possible. Because a crime of this kind, a crime committed not in passion, not in sudden anger, but with deliberation and patience, does not arise from a single moment. It arises from many moments accumulated over many years, until their accumulated weight becomes insupportable." He let his gaze move across the room. "This family is, if I may say so, a very good illustration of how a great deal of pain may be generated without anyone raising their voice, or breaking a single law. Thomas looked at the mantelpiece. Daniel looked at the floor. Clara looked at Thomas. Eleanor looked at Poirot with the steady, slightly exhausted attention of a woman who has known something for 50 years and is experiencing the complicated relief of its finally being spoken aloud. Gerald Whitcombe was not a violent man, Poirot continued. He did not shout. He did not strike. He was, by any visible measure, a respectable patriarch who provided for his family and maintained his household. But he was also a man who used his approval as a commodity, dispensing it narrowly, withdrawing it at will, and who had, over the course of a long marriage, reduced his wife by increments to something functionally invisible. He paused. A chair is not invisible. One sees it, one sits in it, one depends upon it absolutely, but one does not inquire whether the chair is content. Daniel made a sharp, involuntary sound, not quite a word. He pressed his lips together and said nothing. "The question I have asked myself," Poirot said, "is not who had the motive. Several people in this room had grievance enough. It is who had the particular combination of knowledge, access, and the cold clarity of purpose that this crime required." He moved a small step to the left, away from the wing chair, as though distancing himself from its proprietorial atmosphere. The poison came from the locked pantry cupboard, and the key lived on the kitchen dresser. The pantry was Mrs. Whitcombe's domain, as, indeed, was the whole of the domestic life of this house. She knew its every particular. She knew the rat poison tin. She knew the preserving jars on the lower shelf, and she knew which small, unlabelled jar recently placed among them contained rather more than dried herbs. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her expression had not changed since Poirot had begun speaking. It held the quality of a person who has prepared for a journey and is waiting, with neither anticipation nor dread, for the train. "The honey was the mechanism," Poirot continued, his voice even, unhurried. "Gerald never used honey. This was known to everyone at the table, known to the household, known as one of the fixed facts of breakfast at Briar Hollow. Then, on the Tuesday before his death, at tea-time, he mentioned to his granddaughter that he intended to try the new honey from the village. A small remark, an unprecedented one. Lucy's name had not been spoken, but Clara put one hand briefly to her mouth. Poirot noted this and continued without pause. The remark was overheard, as remarks in this house tend to be overheard, because this house has thin walls, and a woman who has spent 40 years attending to its every sound. That evening, the unlabelled jar was prepared. On Wednesday morning, before the family descended, Mrs. Whitcombe was in the kitchen, as she is always in the kitchen. She went to the pantry. She went, also, we know this from the soil, to the kitchen herb bed, though the herbs were not due to be watered until Thursday. She returned inside. She laid the table. She placed the honey jar at Gerald's setting, its cork already removed. He stopped. The room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly on the lane beyond the garden wall, its sound arriving and receding like a parenthesis. Gerald came down at 8:28. He ate his porridge with the honey. By 9:30 he was dead. Thomas had gone very pale. He was gripping the edge of the mantelpiece with a hand whose whitened knuckles told their own story of a man holding himself together by main force. "Mother," he said. Just the word, without anything following it, as though he had reached for a sentence and found it had nothing to stand on. Margaret turned her head and looked at her son. Her expression was not defiant, not remorseful, not theatrical in any fashion. It was the expression of a woman who has at last been fully seen, and who finds the experience neither comfortable nor entirely unwelcome. "It is all correct," she said quietly. "Everything Monsieur Poirot has said." The room absorbed this. It absorbed it in the manner of a room that has been built to contain things, silences, secrets, the furniture of decades. And that receives one more weight without outward collapse. Daniel turned from the window. His face had undergone some private rearrangement since Poirot had begun speaking. What had been rigid was now something else, something less armoured and more open to the wind. He looked at his mother and said, in a voice stripped of its habitual irony, "The garden, in April. That was when you decided." "That was when I understood," said Margaret, with the care of a woman distinguishing between two things that look alike but are not. I had been deciding, I think, for considerably longer." Clara had taken Thomas's hand without appearing to notice she had done so. She was looking at Margaret with an expression that Poirot had been unable to classify earlier in the week and could now read plainly. It was the expression of a woman who has watched another woman disappear by degrees into her own household and has seen, without ever finding the language for it, exactly what was happening and what it cost. "She always said, 'Sorry,'" said a voice from the doorway. Lucy stood there in her school uniform, satchel in hand, having apparently descended the staircase with the noiseless efficiency of a child, determined not to be shepherded away from important events a second time. She looked at no one in particular when she spoke, addressing the room rather than any person in it, in the manner of someone reporting an observed fact to an appropriate authority. Whenever grandfather was cross about something, whenever anything went wrong, grandmother said sorry. Even if it wasn't her fault, even if it wasn't anything to do with her at all, she paused. I always thought that was strange. No one spoke. Clara made a small movement towards her daughter and stopped. "It is not strange," said Poirot gently. "It is the habit formed by a great many years of being made to feel responsible for the weather." He looked at Lucy with a grave, considered respect. "You are a very observant young person." Lucy received this without visible pleasure, which suggested she was accustomed to it and found accuracy its own sufficient reward. She came into the room and sat beside her mother. Inspector Graves had been taking notes. He closed his notebook now with the quiet click of a man who has what he needs and is sufficiently human to feel the weight of having it. He looked at Poirot, who gave a small nod. He looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Whitcombe," he said, "I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me." "Yes," said Margaret. She rose with unhurried composure, smoothed her skirt, and looked around the drawing room with the particular attention of a person committing a familiar room to a different kind of memory. The worn arms of the sofa, the photographs on the mantelpiece, the empty wing chair. She looked at the wing chair for a moment. The first time, Poirot thought, that he had ever seen her look at it directly rather than around it, past it, or in careful avoidance of it. Then she turned to her children. "Thomas," she said, "the boiler wants attention on Fridays. Daniel, the third stair needs fixing now, I think. Clara." She stopped, and something shifted in her face for just a moment. A crack in the composure, quickly closed, through which something enormous and unnameable briefly showed itself. You have always been kinder to me than you knew." Clara stood, and they held each other briefly in the unpracticed way of women in a family that has not been given much room for it. Poirot did not look away. He felt that to look away would be a form of disrespect to the truth of what he was witnessing, to the cost at which it had arrived. Margaret followed Inspector Graves from the room without looking back. Her footsteps were even and unhurried on the hall floor. The front door opened, admitting a brief gasp of October air, and then closed. The drawing room was very quiet. Gerald's chair stood in its place by the fire, empty and immovable, as though waiting for something that was not going to come. It was Daniel who broke the silence. He was still at the window, his back to the room, and when he spoke, his voice was very flat and very careful, the voice of a man who is being precise, because precision is the only thing standing between him and something he cannot yet afford to feel. "She did it," he said, "so that we would notice. No one contested this. It hung in the room with the particular weight of a thing that is true in more ways than one person has yet fully reckoned." Poirot said nothing. He had long since learned that the moments after a revelation required space rather than commentary, and that the little grey cells, having done their work, were wise enough to rest. With Chapter 9, The Table Where It Happened. The dining table at Briar Hollow sat 8 comfortably and 10 at a pinch, which was information Poirot had extracted from Mrs. Hargreaves during one of his early, apparently aimless conversations about the domestic arrangements. He had noted it without yet knowing why, filed it with the faithfulness of a man who collects details before he understands them. And now, on the evening of the day Margaret Whitcombe had been taken away, he found it pressing itself forward as a detail of sudden and specific relevance. The family had eaten supper at 7. It had been a quiet meal, quieter than the silence of Gerald's absence, which had been the loudest silence Poirot had encountered at any table, and had been assembled by Mrs. Hargreaves with the stoic efficiency of a woman who considers that people must be fed regardless of the circumstances, and that the circumstances of the Whitcombe family over the past week had not been such as to alter this principle. Cold meat, bread, a soup that had been made with feeling, if not with appetite. Now, at 8:30, the plates were cleared and the family remained. This was not something they had arranged. They had simply not dispersed in the way that people sometimes do not disperse after a significant event, finding themselves held at the table by the residue of the thing that has happened there. As though movement in such moments constitutes a kind of betrayal of its weight. Thomas sat at the head of the table, which was itself a small, inadvertent claim upon the future. Clara was beside him, and Daniel was at the far end, where he had migrated over the course of the meal, as though he required the length of the table between himself and the chair his father had occupied. Eleanor was in her place beside the window. Lucy had been permitted to remain, which was Clara's decision, made without discussion, and which no one had questioned. Poirot occupied his usual guest's position in the middle, flanked by the empty places that the table's reduced number had left unfilled. His coffee sat before him, untouched but warm. He had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had arrived, not with any particular announcement, but with the quality that right moments have of presenting themselves as the natural next thing. "There is something remaining," he said, "that I wish to say to you as a family, not as a detective. As a man who has spent a week in this house and has, in that time, understood it rather well. Thomas looked at him. The others looked at him. Eleanor, who had been examining the dark garden beyond the window, turned with the deliberate attention of a woman who has waited a long time for an honest conversation and does not intend to miss its beginning. "Your mother did not act without reason," Poirot said. "I do not say this to excuse what she did. A life was taken, and the law will address that, and it is not for me to mitigate its address. But the law will speak to what was done, and I wish to speak, briefly, and I think, necessarily, to what was done to her." He turned his cup on its saucer, the small, precise adjustment of a man organizing his thoughts. A family is a system. Like all systems, it has a logic, a set of rules, usually unspoken, by which it operates and perpetuates itself. In this family, the rules were these: that Gerald Whitcombe was the centre of gravity, that his approval was the currency of belonging, and that the maintenance of his comfort was the primary work of the household. All other needs were subordinate to this. All other persons arranged themselves in relation to it. He looked at Thomas. "You, Thomas, learned early that reliability was what was required of you. You became reliable, thoroughly, entirely, at some cost to other qualities you might have developed." Thomas received this without flinching. His expression was that of a man accepting a diagnosis he had suspected but not permitted himself to confirm. "Daniel," Poirot's voice did not change its register, "you learned that Gerald's approval was not available to you on any terms you were prepared to accept. So you left. You spent years in London not primarily in pursuit of success, but in pursuit of a life in which the terms of your own worth were set by some authority other than your father." He paused. "The misfortune is that one cannot leave a family system entirely. It travels." Daniel looked at the table. A muscle in his jaw moved. He said nothing, which was, for Daniel, a form of assent. "Clara." Poirot turned to her with a slight inclination of his head. "You entered this family as an outsider and remained one, not from any failure on your part, but because the system had no designated place for a woman who observed it clearly and was not deceived by its surfaces. You saw what was happening to Margaret, or you saw it for years." He met her eyes. "And you did not know how to name it, or to whom you might name it, or whether naming it would accomplish anything at all beyond the rearrangement of your own position in a household where positions were already precarious." Clara looked at her hands. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't know how. This is not a moral failing. It is the particular difficulty of a wrong that announces itself in no single decisive act." He looked now at Eleanor, who returned his gaze with the steady, unsurprised attention she had brought to every exchange between them. "You, Eleanor, have carried a specific knowledge for 50 years. You knew how your brother obtained Margaret. You knew what was erased in order to place her here, in this house, in this role. You carried that knowledge in silence and was the price of your own continued belonging." Eleanor said very quietly, "Yes." "And the weight of it," said Poirot, "has not been light." "No," said Eleanor, "it has not." The table held the silence that followed with the solemnity it deserved. Outside, the October wind moved in the beeches, and the house made its small, habitual sounds. The tick of the clock, the faint settling of old timber, as it had always made them and would continue to make them, regardless. "I want to ask you each to consider," Poirot continued, with the care of a man who is saying a difficult thing because it is true rather than because it is welcome. Not what your mother did, but what made it possible for her to do it. Not the poison and the honey jar. Those are the mechanism, and they have been accounted for. I ask about the other mechanism, the one that operated for 40 years in this dining room, at this table in the daily allocation of notice and care and acknowledgement. That mechanism was not one person's construction, it was everyone's maintenance. Thomas made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man upon whose shoulders something has just settled with its full weight. "I do not say this to add to your suffering," Poirot said. "I say it because your mother's suffering was, for 40 years, invisible in this house. And I think she would not wish, I think she would consider it a poor outcome, if it remained invisible after everything that has now occurred to make it visible." He looked at each of them in turn, finishing with Lucy, who was watching him with the grave and complete attention of a child who understands that she is being included in something important and is taking the responsibility seriously. "She watered her herbs on a Wednesday," said Poirot, "the smallest departure from the rhythm of 40 years. And it was enough. It is always the small thing." He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold, which was something he would normally find insupportable, but he drank it anyway, because the moment did not call for the fastidiousness of ordinary life. Daniel broke the silence that had settled after Poirot finished. He did not look up from the table when he spoke, and his voice had none of its habitual edge. It was simply the voice of a man saying what he believed to be true. "She always said sorry," he said. "I used to think she was acquiescing, performing the role, but she wasn't, was she? She was just... She had learned that sorry was what was required, and she produced it because she had learned to produce what was required." He paused. "Until she didn't. Until she decided," Poirot said, "that the cost of continuance had exceeded what any person could reasonably be asked to pay." He set down his cup. He looked at the table, at its length, its good solid oak, its surface marked here and there by the ordinary use of decades. At the set-in where Gerald had always sat, bare now of plate and cup, and the honey jar that had been its last addition. "She asked me this morning," Poirot said, "what would happen now. I told her that there were things that must be faced, and that I would not deceive her as to what they were." He folded his hands. "I tell you the same. What faces your mother is serious, and the law is not sentimental, and I would not insult you by suggesting otherwise." He paused. "But she went knowing she had been seen. For the first time in longer than any of you can measure, she was completely seen. That is not nothing. I think, for her, it was rather a great deal." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Clara, quietly, reached across and refilled Thomas's glass from the water jug. The small domestic gesture in the large dining room. The hand that feeds, continuing. Poirot pushed back his chair. He stood. He looked at them all, this family, this system, this particular arrangement of people around a table that had shaped them and been shaped by them. And he felt what he sometimes felt at the end of things, the weight of what had been revealed, and the knowledge that revelation, however necessary, does not undo. "Be kind to one another," said Hercule Poirot. "More than you have been. It is not complicated advice. It is merely the most important." He bade them good night and went upstairs, stepping over the third stair from long habit now, as though it were simply a feature of the house he lived in, rather than a clue he had followed to its end. Chapter 10. The Empty Chair. Poirot left Briar Hollow on a Friday morning, which was not a Thursday. He had remained 3 days after Margaret's departure, partly because Inspector Graves had required a formal statement. A lengthy, meticulous affair that the inspector received with the respectful attention due to a document he would spend considerable time reformatting, and partly because he had found, to his mild self-reproach, that he was reluctant to go. He had stayed in many houses in the course of his long career, in the company of murderers and victims and the complicated catalogue of those who were neither and both, and he did not generally linger. But Briar Hollow had settled into him in some way he had not anticipated, and he wished to leave it properly, which required knowing what properly meant. He came downstairs on the Friday morning to find that the toast had burned. No one had noticed it burning. It sat in the rack on the breakfast table. 3 slices of carbonized bread, producing a thin veil of smoke that had found its way through the kitchen door and was distributing itself gently across the dining room. Daniel was at the table reading the newspaper with the concentration of a man who is not reading it. Thomas was in the hall, looking for something he could not locate, and the tea had been made at some point and forgotten on the range, where it was achieving by now the deep amber of a substance that had long since exceeded its intended function. Clara appeared from the kitchen with a look of discovered catastrophe. "The toast," she said to the general air. "Leave it," said Daniel, without lowering the paper. Clara left it. She sat down and poured herself tea from the forgotten pot, and did not comment on its condition. Thomas came into the dining room, failed to find whatever he had been looking for, and sat down as well. 3 adults at a table built for 8, in a house whose rhythms had, overnight, lost the person who had maintained them, discovering that maintenance is not a thing one notices until it stops. Poirot observed all of this from the doorway with the quiet attention he had given to his first morning at Briar Hollow, and thought that the distance between then and now was both very great, and, in the way of essential things, not so great at all. He sat down. He accepted the overlarge tea without remark. He looked at Gerald's chair, which stood at the head of the table, precisely where it had always stood, undisturbed, as though waiting for an occupant who had merely stepped out and would presently return. No one sat in it. No one had sat in it since the morning of the murder. It was not clear to Poirot whether this constituted grief, habit, or the particular confusion of a family that had organized itself around a fixed point, and did not yet know, with that point removed, quite how to arrange itself. "Lucy watered the herbs yesterday," said Clara, in the manner of a woman reporting a small event whose significance she has not yet fully determined. "On her own. I looked out at 4:30, and there she was with the watering can." "It was Thursday," said Daniel. "Yes," said Clara, "it was." The table received this. Outside the kitchen window, in the raised bed against the south wall, the rosemary and thyme stood in their close autumn green, watered and continuing. Eleanor came to the dining-room door at 8:30, looked at the burned toast and the forgotten tea, and the 3 adults sitting in the silence of people who have not yet learned to distribute a task that was always performed by the same hands, and said, with the dry practicality of a woman who has survived a great many things, and intends to survive this also, I will make fresh toast. Thomas, the tea requires attention. Daniel, put down that newspaper and lay the table properly. This house does not run itself." She disappeared back into the kitchen. After a brief pause, the dining room began, haltingly, to comply. Poirot watched this with a feeling he did not immediately identify and then did. It was something close to hope, though of the restrained and realistic variety that long experience had taught him was the only kind worth entertaining. He had his bags brought down after breakfast and said his farewells in the hall, which was the proper room for it. Thomas shook his hand with the firm, slightly over-length grip of a man expressing gratitude. He does not quite have the vocabulary to speak directly. Clara said she hoped he would come again. Anne meant it in the complicated way of a person who hopes and does not hope for the same thing simultaneously. Eleanor said only, "You did what was necessary," which was, from Eleanor, rather a great deal. Daniel walked him to the taxi. They stood on the gravel for a moment in the thin October sunshine while the driver loaded the bags with an efficiency that suggested he found the emotional climate of his passengers' farewells none of his business. Daniel had his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, in the manner that Poirot had come to recognize as his substitute for direct statement. "She knew you would work it out," Daniel said. "From the beginning, I think. She invited you here herself through Thomas's solicitor. She could have done nothing. She could have let Graves have me, and I—" He stopped. I started again. "I had been drinking in the village the morning she died. I was not in the house between 7:30 and 8:30. I had no alibi. She knew that. She knew how it would look." Poirot regarded him carefully. "You are saying she did not choose an innocent victim for misdirection." "I am saying she would never have let it stand." Daniel looked at the house. "She wrote to the solicitor 3 weeks before. She named you specifically. She said she required a detective of the first order, because the matter would require, I think the word she used was, discernment." The corner of his mouth moved. She was rather particular about the word. Poirot was quiet for a moment. The taxi driver settled behind the wheel with the resigned patience of his profession. "She wanted to be seen," said Poirot. "Correctly, without diminishment. She wanted the truth of her life and the truth of what she did to be understood by someone capable of understanding it." He looked at Daniel steadily. "And she wanted to be certain that you were not made to carry what was not yours." Daniel swallowed. It was the only unguarded thing he had done in Poirot's presence, and it was enough. "She left a shopping list," Daniel said after a moment. "On the kitchen board, milk, basil, honey." He said the last word with the slight catch of a man who has not yet mastered the ordinary words that have become extraordinary. "Mrs. Hargreaves found it the morning after. She hasn't taken it down." "No," said Poirot. "I do not think she will take it down for some time." He shook Daniel's hand and got into the taxi. The door closed. The gravel crunched under the wheels as the car turned on the drive and began its progress towards the lane. Poirot looked back once. Briar Hollow stood as it had always stood. The dark red brick, the unloving but well-kept garden, the beeches releasing their last copper leaves in the October wind. The lights were on in the kitchen. Through the drawing-room window he could see, at this distance and angle, the silhouette of Gerald's chair beside the dark fireplace, empty and patient as a question to which no one had yet determined the answer. He turned back to face the lane. He thought about Margaret Whitcombe. He thought about her in the way he sometimes thought about the cases that stayed with him. Not the mechanism of the crime, which was fully accounted for, but the human thing beneath it. The young woman in the face-down photograph a laughing in a garden that was not Briar Hollow. The 40 years between that woman and the one who had sat across from him in the kitchen and said, without self-pity, that it is a small thing to be unseen. The fall in the garden, the blue sky, the arithmetic performed in solitude on a Wednesday morning before the household woke. He had admired her. He admitted this to himself in the back of the taxi with the honesty he always eventually managed, even when it took some time. He had admired her intelligence, her composure, her refusal to diminish herself even in the act of confession. He had not admired what she did. Both of these things were true, and they did not resolve each other, and he suspected they never would, which was the particular difficulty of cases in which the monster is entirely absent and the perpetrator is entirely human. Justice was not the same as rightness. He had known this for a long time. He served justice because it was what could be served, and because an innocent man in a cell was an insupportable affront to everything he believed, and because the law, however imperfect, was the best instrument available for preventing the strong from erasing the weak without consequence. But he did not always confuse it with a deeper thing. The taxi reached the lane and turned. Briar Hollow disappeared behind the beech trees. Poirot settled his coat, adjusted his hat, and directed his thoughts forward, toward London and his flat and the ordered symmetry of his rooms, where the objects on his desk would be precisely where he had left them, and the proportion of things would be as he preferred. He would have George press his travelling suit. He would have proper coffee. He would sit in his own chair which fitted him exactly, and he would allow the little grey cells their well-earned repose. But he found, as the Surrey lanes unspooled themselves toward the station, that his thoughts returned once more to the kitchen garden at Briar Hollow, to Lucy at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, with the watering can, the herbs standing in their patient green, the house behind her, its lights burning in the early autumn dark. There is, in old woodland, a practice of driving a nail into the trunk of a young tree. In time, the tree grows around the nail. It does not remove the nail. It incorporates it, works its living wood around the foreign thing, enclosing it, until from the outside the tree appears entire and the wound is invisible. Whether this is healing, or merely the accommodation of a damage that was always going to be permanent, is a question that depends on what one means by healing and what one is prepared to call whole. Poirot had no answer. In 40 years of examining human nature at its most extreme and most ordinary, he had not encountered one. He suspected the tree itself, if asked, would not know how to reply. The station came into view. He gathered his hat and his coat and his small bag, and prepared, with characteristic precision, to depart. Behind him, in the house that had swallowed its own, the lights burned on. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its small, faithful measurement of hours. The chair stood empty, and in the kitchen, on the board beside the window, a shopping list in Margaret Whitcombe's typeset hand recorded 3 items that would not now be bought. Hung in a house that was learning, slowly and imperfectly and together, how to provide for itself,